All right, let's dive into real estate agency in Georgia today. If you're buying or selling, you want to make sure you're getting the best representation possible. So we've got all kinds of resources for this deep dive. We've got legal definitions, we've got real-world examples, we've even got some scenarios ripped right from the headlines, just to help you navigate the wild world of agents and clients. And those all-important fiduciary duties.
What's really fascinating about Georgia is it's kind of a unique set of rules. It's
Yeah.
not a one-size-fits-all kind of state.
Yeah, you can't just find an agent with a friendly face. You really need to understand, the levels of representation, who owes what to whom. And we'll even tackle the big question, can you ever really trust an agent who's working both sides of a deal?
Yeah, that's when things get really, really interesting. Speaking of trust, we'll also look into antitrust laws and making sure you don't end up on the wrong side of the DOJ.
Yeah, nobody wants a knock on the door from the DOJ. Okay, so first things first, let's define agency in the real estate world.
So essentially, an agent is someone who acts on another person's behalf in a real estate transaction, and they are legally bound to represent your best interest.
So they're like your real estate wingman, making sure you're getting the best deal, navigating all the legal jargon and all that.
Exactly. But here's the catch. The level of representation and the duties that an agent owes you can really vary, and it really boils down to whether you're a client or a customer.
Uh-huh. So it's not just about who's cutting the commission check.
Right. You can't just assume that because an agent is showing you properties,
Mm-hmm.
that they're automatically working for you as a client.
So how do you know when you've crossed that line from, just casually looking at houses to actually having that client relationship?
Well, Georgia's BRRETA lays it all out. That's the Brokerage Relationships in Real Estate Transactions Act. It really defines a brokerage engagement. And essentially, that's your golden ticket to full client status. And that's when those fiduciary duties really kick in.
And that's when they have to be totally loyal to your interests. We're not just talking about, casual advice anymore, are we?
Absolutely. They owe you a whole bundle of responsibilities. You can think of it as old car, obedience, loyalty, disclosure, confidentiality accounting, and reasonable skill and care.
Oldie car. I love it. That's way easier to remember than a bunch of legal terms.
Right, it encapsulates everything you need to know about what an agent owes their client.
Okay, so oldie car is for clients. What about those customers? What kind of treatment can they expect?
Customers are still owed basic fairness and honesty, but they don't get that full package of fiduciary duties. Think of it like this. If you're a buyer and your agent is showing you a property, that seller is considered a customer, not a client, even though they're typically the one paying the commission.
So the seller isn't getting that same level of loyalty from the agent. That's a bit of a mind bender.
It is, and that's where understanding the different types of agency is really crucial. In Georgia, we have single agency, dual agency, and designated agency, and each has its own set of rules and potential pitfalls.
Okay, so let's unpack those. Single agency seems pretty straightforward. You're representing only one side in the deal, either the buyer or the seller.
Yes, and single agency offers that clearest path to loyalty. You know your agent is solely focused on your best interests, without any competing obligations.
So fewer headaches and potential conflicts of interest.
Exactly. Now let's move on to the more complex scenario, dual agency. Imagine an agent is representing both the buyer and the seller in the same transaction.
Ooh, that sounds tricky. Can you really wear two hats like that and be fair to both sides?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. Dual agency in Georgia requires informed consent from both parties. They need to understand those inherent conflicts and sign off on it willingly.
But isn't there always a risk, even with the best of intentions, that an agent might accidentally, slip up and share information that could benefit one side over the other?
You've hit the nail on the head. That's why Georgia has this other option called designated agency.
So it's like dual agency, but with some added safeguards.
Exactly. So in designated agency, you still have two agents from the same brokerage, representing the buyer and the seller. But they operate with a sort of firewall between them.
So they're supposed to keep information separate and avoid any appearance of favoritism.
Precisely. And the broker who's overseeing both agents isn't considered a dual agent in this case. It's Georgia's way of trying to mitigate those conflict of interest landmines.
I mean, this is where it gets really interesting for someone like me, who's always wondered, can I really trust an agent who's working both sides of the deal? And it seems like Georgia law is trying to find that sweet spot.
You got it. And remember, whether you're going with single, dual, or designated agency, that old car acronym is still your guide. to what your agent should be doing for you as a client.
Okay, this is all starting to click into place. We've got our agents, our clients, our customers, and those old car duties.
And believe it or not, there's even more to uncover about how these relationships are.
All right, we're just getting warmed up. Stay tuned because in the next part, we'll dive even deeper into the nitty-gritty of agency creation and those pesky antitrust issues, and how to avoid getting tangled up in legal trouble. Welcome back. We are digging deeper into the world of real estate agency in Georgia, making sure you've got all the knowledge to navigate those sometimes choppy waters.
And we're about to wade into some murky territory. How agency relationships are actually formed. Because believe it or not, you can accidentally stumble into an agency agreement.
Without even realizing it.
Wait, really? I thought it was all about those, formal written contracts.
Those are definitely the safest bet, of course. Yeah. That's express agency, crystal clear, spelled out in black and white. Think your standard listing agreement or buyer representation agreement. No room for interpretation there.
But you're saying there's this other, more shadowy way agency can be created. Exactly. It's called implied agency. And it's all about actions speaking louder than words. So let's say you're an agent, and you start giving a buyer specific advice, maybe helping them craft an offer, even though you haven't signed anything official.
So just by doing those helpful agent-y things, you could be stepping into a legal minefield.
Potentially, yes. The buyer could reasonably believe you're their agent, and a court might agree, holding you to those old car duties, even without a written contract. That's why being super clear about your role from the get-go is crucial.
Yikes. That's a cautionary tale for agents out there. Always get things in writing.
Absolutely. And speaking of getting things in writing, there's also this concept called ratification. So imagine a buyer initially says, no, thanks, I don't need representation. But then, after you've helped them negotiate a tricky offer, they decide they want to make it official and sign an agreement.
So they're essentially acknowledging that you were acting as their agent all along.
Precisely. And then there's estoppel, which is a bit more complex, but equally important. Think of it as being stopped from denying something based on your past actions.
Okay, give me a real-world example here.
Let's say an agent acts like a buyer's agent, giving them advice, showing them properties, but then tries to backpedal and deny any agency relationship when things go wrong. Estoppel could prevent them from doing that if their actions created a reasonable belief that they were, in fact, the buyer's agent.
So even if they never put pen to paper, they could still be on the hook for those fiduciary duties.
Exactly. It's all about protecting consumers and ensuring fair play.
This whole implied agency thing is making me think about, those house hunting shows where buyers are working with agents, but they don't seem to have any formal agreements in place. Is that even legal?
Well, those shows often operate in a bit of a gray area for entertainment purposes. They may gloss over some of those, legal formalities. But in the real world, it's always best to have those agreements in writing to avoid any confusion or potential liability.
Right, so no taking legal advice from reality TV. Okay, so we've covered how agency relationships are formed, but how do they end?
Well, the most common way is simply by completing the transaction. You close on a house, everyone's happy, and the agency relationship naturally comes to an end. Agreements can also expire, or both parties can mutually agree to part ways.
And sometimes things end a little more dramatically, right?
Yes, there are those force of law situations, like if the property is destroyed or one of the parties passes away or there's bankruptcy involved. Those events would automatically terminate the agency relationship.
What about if a client just decides, you know what, I don't want to work with this agent anymore. Can they just fire them?
They can revoke the agreement, yes, and an agent can also renounce the agreement. But there might be consequences, depending on the terms of the contract and the circumstances surrounding the termination.
So it's not always a clean break.
Not necessarily. And here's a Georgia-specific tidbit. If there's no specified termination date in the agreement, it automatically ends after 1 year.
Interesting. So even if everything's going swimmingly, they have to renew that agreement after a year to keep things official?
Precisely. It's all about clarity.
Yeah.
And making sure everyone's on the same page.
Now, we've talked about oldie car, and those fiduciary duties agents owe their clients. Do any of those responsibilities linger, even after the agency relationship ends?
Absolutely. Confidentiality for one lasts forever. You can't just spill your former client's secrets once the contract is over.
Makes sense. It'd be a huge breach of trust.
Exactly. And the duty of accounting continues until all money and property related to the transaction are accounted for.
Okay, so even though the deal is done, there's still some paperwork and ethical obligations to tie up.
Right. And this is where things can get a little tricky. When agency relationships change over time, Let's say you represented a seller a few years back, and now they're buying a new property, and you happen to be working with a seller of that property.
So your former client is now on the other side of the deal.
Exactly. You could absolutely represent someone different in a later transaction, even if it means going up against a former client. But that confidentiality from the past relationship still applies. You can't use any information you learned during that previous representation to gain an advantage for your current client.
That sounds like a tightrope walk.
It can be. It's all about maintaining those ethical boundaries and avoiding even the appearance of a conflict of interest.
So if I'm a buyer or seller in Georgia, how do I make sure I'm getting the best representation and avoiding any potential pitfalls with these shifting agency relationships?
The key is communication. Ask your agent about their experience with different types of agency, how they handle confidentiality, and what steps they take to avoid conflicts of interest.
So don't be afraid to ask those tough questions up front.
Exactly. And remember, knowledge is power. The more you understand about agency, the better equipped you'll be to make informed decisions and protect your interests.
Now, earlier we mentioned antitrust laws lurking in the background. Let's shine a light on those, because they can have some serious consequences for agents who aren't careful.
That's right. Antitrust laws are all about preventing unfair competition that can harm consumers. We're talking about things like price fixing, group boycotting, market allocation, and tie-in arrangements.
Okay, break those down for me. What exactly is price fixing?
So imagine a group of brokerages in an area get together and decide they're all going to charge a 6% commission. That's price fixing, eliminating competition, and potentially driving up costs for consumers.
So it's like a secret pact to keep prices artificially high.
Exactly. And it doesn't have to be that blatant. Even subtle hints or agreements about fees can be problematic.
That makes sense. So how do agents avoid accidentally stepping over that line?
Set your own rates independently, based on your services and the value you bring. Don't discuss fees with competitors. And be careful about using language that implies a standard or fixed commission rate.
Okay, so no casual chats with your competition about how much you're charging. What about group boycotting? How does that play out in real estate?
Imagine a group of traditional brokerages decide they're not going to work with a new discount brokerage.
Yep.
That's shaking things up. That's a classic example of group boycotting, trying to shut someone out of the market.
So it's about protecting their turf and stifling competition.
Exactly. And the same goes for market allocation. That's when competitors agree to divide up a market among themselves, maybe by geographic area or property type.
They'll say, you take the north side of town, and I'll take the south side. And we'll avoid stepping on each other's toes.
Exactly. It limits consumer choice and can lead to higher prices.
And finally, what are those tie-in arrangements you mentioned?
That's when someone makes one service conditional on you using another service from a specific provider. Like, hey, I'll sell your house, but only if you use my brother-in-law for your mortgage.
This is all about leveraging one service to force you into using another, potentially limiting your options and costing you more money.
You got it.
Wow, this antitrust stuff is serious business. What happens if an agent gets caught violating these laws?
The penalties can be severe. We're talking fines, lawsuits,
Yeah.
and even jail time in some cases. The Department of Justice doesn't mess around when it comes to protecting fair competition.
Okay, this has definitely been a sobering
Mm,
but necessary reality check.
it is, but understanding these risks is crucial. For both consumers and professionals, it's about creating a fair and transparent real estate market for everyone.
Now, I know we've covered a lot of ground already, but there's still one more piece of the puzzle to explore. How do agency relationships evolve over time? And what does that mean for your obligations as an agent?
That's a great question, and we'll tackle that head on. In the final part of our deep dive, we'll examine real-world scenarios where past clients become future customers and vice versa, and how those lingering duties, especially confidentiality, can create some tricky ethical dilemmas.
All right, we're heading into the final stretch of our real estate agency marathon. Stay tuned for the grand finale, where we'll unravel those last few mysteries and leave you with the knowledge you need to conquer the Georgia real estate world.
Welcome back to the final stretch of our deep dive into real estate agency in Georgia. We've covered a lot of ground, from oldie car die and those fiduciary duties to all those antitrust violations and how to avoid them.
Yeah, and now we're going to explore one of the most nuanced aspects of agency, how these relationships can evolve over time, sometimes in surprising ways.
It's like that saying, no one's a stranger, just a friend you haven't met yet.
Right.
But in real estate, it might be more like, no one's a stranger, just a past client who might end up on the other side of your next deal.
Exactly. And this is where those ethical boundaries and lingering duties we talked about become absolutely crucial. So let's say you represented a buyer a few years back. And they got a fantastic deal on a charming fixer-upper. You learned a lot about their financial situation, their motivations for buying, maybe even some personal details they shared during the process. So you've got this treasure trove of insider information.
Right. Now, fast forward a few years, and you're representing a seller who's listing that same fixer-upper, now beautifully renovated. Your current client is aiming for top dollar naturally.
But you, as the agent, have this inside scoop from your past representation. That could give your seller an edge.
Exactly. Maybe you know the buyer had to stretch their budget back then and might be willing to overpay now that they've built some equity.
So tempting to use that knowledge right. It could help your current client get a higher price.
It's a classic ethical dilemma. But remember that duty of confidentiality. It doesn't have an expiration date. You absolutely cannot use any information you learned during that past representation to benefit your current client, even if it seems like a win-win situation.
So even if it feels like that information is just sitting there, ripe for the picking, got to keep it locked away.
Absolutely. It wouldn't be fair to your former client. And it could even land you in legal hot water. Remember, loyalty and confidentiality are cornerstones of ethical real estate practice.
It's like you're wearing two hats, but one of them is permanently glued to your head.
You could say that. It's about understanding that every interaction, every relationship you build in this business carries a certain weight, a certain responsibility. That extends beyond the transaction itself.
Okay, so let's flip the script. What if you represented a seller in the past, and now they're back as a buyer, interested in a property you're listing for a different client?
Same rules apply. You can't use any confidential information you gain from that past representation to give your buyer client an unfair advantage.
So no leveraging knowledge about the seller's bottom line or any weaknesses in their negotiating position.
Exactly. It's about approaching each new transaction with fresh perspective and those unwavering ethical boundaries.
Okay, this is all starting to make a lot of sense, but it also highlights the importance of choosing an agent who really understands these nuances. So if I'm looking to buy or sell a property in Georgia, how do I find an agent who will not only represent my interests, but also uphold these ethical standards?
Well, don't be afraid to ask those tough questions up front. Find out how they handle dual agency designated agency and those situations where past clients reappear in future transactions. Ask about their experience navigating potential conflicts of interest and their commitment to confidentiality.
So it's like interviewing them for the job of representing you.
Precisely. You're trusting them with one of the biggest financial decisions of your life. So due diligence is essential.
And remember, knowledge is power. The more you understand about real estate agency, the better equipped you'll be to make informed decisions and protect your interests.
That's the key takeaway here. It's about empowering yourself as a consumer or a professional in the Georgia real estate market.
Yeah, we've demystified those roles, those duties, and that sometimes confusing legal landscape. So hopefully you're leaving this deep dive feeling confident and ready to tackle your next real estate adventure.
And if you ever find yourself in a sticky situation, remember those oldie car duties. And don't hesitate to consult with a real estate attorney for guidance.
As always, thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We'll see you next time, ready to explore another fascinating topic.